and this sort of thing. When the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a British trade unionist leader called Ken Gill, who was leader of TAS, a certain section of the electrical engineering union. And he said that when the Soviet Union collapsed, a bloke with a broad Wiltshire accent, a genuinely working class communist, Gill said, a light went out for humanity when the Soviet Union went down. A light went out, and he died soon after. Because you see, for people like him, it was a pseudo-religion. And it was a belief in a radiant future, as they used to call it in the ideology, a radiant future for the Nazis. You know? And there was a belief in it. It's why all these people spied and so on. Of course, many of them did it because they had money, they were perverts, they were rebels against their own system. But never forget that many of them converted to it, like a quasi-religious conversion. Maclean, who was part of the Filby ring at Cambridge, read an incredibly boring book called Materialism and Empirico-Criticism by Lenin, which is based upon the materialism of a scientist at the beginning of the 20th century called Mach. And the light came into his eyes. Now history is clear to me. There is a plan. There is progress from the agricultural to the industrial stage through the dialectical reversal via the vanguard that creates socialism that is above the masses, and eventually all the apparatus that is needed to install this, the terror, the lies, the propaganda, the secret police, the endless purging, the mass graves, will all fade away. All fade away and be replaced by love and by the encomium of forgiveness, as all members in all classes embrace each other, and there's no division. There's no division of race, of kind, of class, of gender, of ideology. All are one. All are one in the radiant future. And that's socialism, you see. And there's a stage even beyond socialism, communism. Because if you listen to the communist parties when they're in power, they will say that socialism is just an approximation to that which exists beyond there. Another quasi-religious idea, really a quasi-idealistic conception, whereby the perfection of the future is still to be announced. And in that moment, the state itself will wither away. There'll be no secret policemen that start kissing their rubber truncheons and this sort of thing and throwing them away. It's all going to die before the dispensation of love and that sort of thing. But down in the abattoir, you know, comrades have got some dirty work to do in the name of progress. You know, and it is, if you look at it, it is an enormous sort of materialist Greek tragedy acted out over about a century and a half. Because it affected and changed the whole nature of the world, this ideology. China, of course, has done a reverse trick. They've kept an authoritarian, technocratic regime that's frozen the ideology like a theology it no longer even listens to, and has introduced the most aggressive form of capitalism on earth, using the very structures of authoritarian rule that were supposed to bring in its opposite. So there's a strange hybrid, you know, and you have these sort of dinosaur states like North Korea, which strongly resembles in the cult of the emperor, stroke the Kim Il-sung figure who's worshipped like a god. Didn't you know he discovered the light bulb? Didn't you know he wrote all the books in the British Library? Didn't you know he painted personally the roof of the Sistine Chapel? Didn't you know that virtually every scientific development has been done by Kim Il-sung and his semi-dead son and that sort of thing? Because most North Koreans are taught this all the time. There are also very interesting elements in the fugitiveness of communist ideology, where you do wonder whether it's a materialist belief system at all. In camps in North Korea, if a dissident has a child, a woman, often the child will be killed by a commissar. The child will be born, the child will be presented as the child of a deviant and of a thought criminal. This is the doctrine of hereditarianism, isn't it? This is the doctrine that the child inherits the social and secular sins of the parent. This isn't a left-wing idea at all, essentially. So it's very odd, mentally. And the child, the commissar will step on its neck and crack it, break it in front of the camp. Dead of a deviant, alien to socialism and the praxis of the masses. I do not this is a crime. I kill not a human. I kill an enemy of the human. When Yugoslav trials killed a large number of people in 1945-46, trials in inverted commas, they were described not as trials of people, but as enemies of the people. The communist jurist would get up on the dot and say, you are an enemy of the people. And he knew what that meant, you know, not long to go. Let's hope it's over quick. I mean, that's what people really thought when they were subjected to this. What this novel does is it draws out the psychological, linguistic and mental processes of what's going on in those quicker sort of enemy of the people type trials, which of course Ceausescu and his tribe got at the end. There is an knock-off principle, isn't there? What goes around comes around, as hippies in the 60s used to say. And I remember when Ceausescu and his wife were tried, the trial lasted for 3 hours. There wasn't much of a defence, just a bloke jabbering a bit, pushed to the side by a military policeman. They were dragged out of the court and shot as terrorists by the National Salvation Front, 2/3 of whom were ex-communists. And remember there's that moment when the camera goes towards them as they're lying on the ground, and the camera flicks onto the faces. The BBC, ITV and CNN, if CNN existed then, cut that because it was too distressing for Western audiences. Too distressing for Western audiences. But you could see the blood on the ground, you know, and they were dead. So they got the trial that they gave many others. And the Securitate, their bastard children, ideologically as well as structurally, fought to the end and died in burning buildings to keep it going. Hodges Albania was an even more extreme example even of that. You could be arrested in Hodges Albania for owning an orange. For owning an orange. Because it had obviously couldn't have been grown there, and you'd imported something from the regimes of the class enemy. So, you know, you were even a criminal for owning a bit of fruit. And that's why, in a very, if you view it in a cross-conscious European way, a very scandalous way, many European politicians from the comfortable West, like Kohl and so on, do you remember he went to East Berlin waving bananas? Waving great bunches of fruit, saying, you haven't seen this, have you? You know, you poor little people, you know, you haven't seen this stuff for 50 years, you know. Extraordinarily condescending, you know, but the liberal materialism was at a much higher level. That's one of the reasons why it collapsed further east. But the interesting thing is that communism is really the product of intellectuals. In some ways it's a sort of revenge of intellectuals as a class upon life. The interesting thing is that some of the softest elements of Western societies, some of the most gone-in-the-tooth elements, also some of the most economically comfortable elements, at the start are the people who pushed the Western and Eastern version of these ideas when they came to power. There's a famous story of Jean Cocteau, which may well be apocryphal, the French artist and poet and writer and film director and all the rest of it. And he's in this, it's about 1910, and Lenin was certainly around then in Parisian salons, as were many other people. Don't forget, Stalin was in Vienna. There are rumours that Hitler, Stalin and Lenin once sat in a street in Vienna in different cafes, and they didn't know the other from the other, all developing their thinking. And you never know, because many of these bohemian undercurrents mix with each other in that decade of proto-revolution between 1900 and 1910, revolving around the Soviet proto-revolution of 1906, the early Soviet attempt at revolutionism. I personally think in a totally differentiated way we're in a similar era now. We're on the threshold of enormous changes, of Herculean changes, the nature of which we don't really understand yet. And I think very like the first decade of the last century, we're looking out on what's coming. Because quite clearly an attack upon Iran is prefigured by much of the rhetoric that's going on now, and much of which is being prepared now. They say they can't weaponize it by 2014, but who knows? So the interesting thing is the support of the wealthy and the intellectual outsider for a belief system that materially offered them very little, but intellectually offered them power. Power. Winston says at the end, what's it all about to O'Brien? What's all the hunger and the torture and the endless war and the propaganda and torturing me to death for a cause I don't really believe in, to say I love Big Brother and then I do and then you shoot me? What's it all for? And O'Brien says, it's for power. Power, he said. Power and more power. Power as a dialectical principle. Remember that great line? If you want the future of the human race, Winston, imagine a boot. A boot. Stamping on a human face forever. And it's a sort of satire on a sort of egomaniacal intellectual power, using ideology purely as a vehicle. And there's very interesting insight into communism there. At the end, Mao lived like a potentate. He lived like an ancient Persian or Egyptian emperor. He was surrounded